Communication Studies podcast. My name is Justin Young. I am a faculty member here in the School of Communication Studies at Southern Illinois University. And this week, my guest is Dr. Todd Graham. Hi, Todd.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well. How's it going for you?
It's solid. Hey, this is my first time in the podcast room. This is pretty cool.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about it. We got this finished over the summer, or half finished at least. We're still doing a little bit of work, but we're pretty excited about it.
No, this is exciting for the department because I've been here for 21 years, and I actually had to Google, where is this today? So I walked around to find it, and this is awesome. I like it. This is great.
All right. A brief introduction of Todd. Todd is the debate coach here for SIU and a very accomplished debate coach, I should say, at that as well. So 4-time Coach of the Year recipient, 6-time national champion, your teams that you've coached, and then also a 9-year run where you were one of the Final Four in the national Championship Debate Tournament.
Yeah, so that's actually my favorite one. So imagine, like, if you're familiar with basketball and the NCAA, like March Madness.
Sure.
Most people are familiar with that. And so, they have names for it. So it's like the Sweet 16, the Elite 8, but then the Final Four, right? So the Final Four are set aside, and it's the last weekend. And so I just look at it that way. It's a really cool way to look at it, which is the teams at Southern Illinois University for 9 consecutive years. Now, that streak has ended now, but for 9 consecutive years, we were in the Final Four of a national championship. So think about like the March Madness basketball. Think about a university that's in the Final Four for 9 straight years. So I think that's quite an accomplishment.
So you are the UCLA or Duke or Kentucky of debate.
Yeah,
is what you're telling us.
we absolutely were. We had that for quite some time. We had a really good run.
Well, that's really impressive and everything. So we're going to talk about some of that. But before we get to that, one of the things I want to talk to you about is how you even got here in the first place. So one of the things that I've been particularly interested in is talking to people about how do you get into communication as a field to begin with? And I know as an undergrad, you actually studied broadcast communication.
Broadcast communication, yeah, I did. I have 3 different degrees in communication. I have a bachelor's in broadcasting. I have a master's in rhetoric, which is persuasion, and then I have a PhD in interpersonal communication. So I've been there the whole time. Funny you ask how I got into it. Now, I know this probably isn't a big way to sell it, but I was a goofy kid. I'm 18 years old, and I'm a freshman at college, and I was on college for a debate scholarship. And I thought, no one told me any better. I thought that meant I had to be a communication major. So I didn't even give any thought to what my major was. I thought that's what I had to do. And my debate coach didn't tell me any different. And so it wasn't until like a year or 2 years on, and they said, you didn't have to be a comm major. And I'm like, oh, well, that's fine. I really like it. This is good.
Right.
But that's how I got into communication in the first place, was I thought that was what I was supposed to do.
So broadcast, were you thinking you might go into radio, television, or was it just that was the area you picked?
Well, I wasn't really sure at the time, but yeah, that sort of seemed a little bit more appealing to me. And because I went to my undergraduate was at Missouri Southern, and it was really a neat time at Missouri Southern because while I was a freshman/sophomore, they built a radio station that went out over the air, and they built a television station for Missouri Southern Television that I ended up working at. I worked shows at. I hosted some different programs. I eventually became operations manager and then general manager by my senior year. So I really enjoyed it, yeah.
So what were some of those shows that you were participating in?
Oh, goodness. So I went back recently to visit Judy Stiles, who was Missouri Southern. She was in charge of the radio television, and Dr. Clark. And Dr. Clark was retiring, and Judy Stiles just retired this year. But I went back to see him with an old friend, Scooter, who was a buddy of mine in college. And we went back a couple summers ago.
Scooter is one of those classic old friend names, right?
I have 2 friends, by the way, from college, and they are Scooter and Chip. You just can't make that up.
Were you in American Graffiti by any chance?
So Scooter and I go back to visit because he still lives in the southern Missouri region, and we go back to visit, and they were talking about how they still had some of the old tapes because, we used to record them on like VHS tapes, and of course they've all updated since then, and so nothing's on those. But they remembered some of my shows, and Judy Stiles still said, to this day, Todd, we still haven't had really anybody like you because I got kicked off of at least least 2 different shows. So I had a show and I got in trouble for it, and then I had another show and then I got in trouble for it. If you want to hear the stories, I could go into that.
Oh, sure. Yes, let's hear them, because I actually had a very similar experience in college. So,
did you really?
Yes.
All right. So one that was pretty tame. It was Scooter and I. We were doing what was a version of Crossfire. Back at the time, Crossfire was a political show on television where they would like put guests in the crossfire, et cetera. And Scooter and I thought, well, let's do that. And he was more politically astute than me at the time. I didn't know that much about politics as an undergraduate because my parents were apolitical. So I didn't really even know what a Democrat or a Republican was. Now, Scooter, on the other hand, he was a diehard Democrat. So not just diehard, but like from the 6th grade on, he was attending city council meetings of Webb City, which is right near Joplin. That's where he lived.
Wow.
He was attending them. He legally changed his name. By the time I met him, his name is John Scott Turner, but he goes by Scooter. So he changed it to John Scott Scooter, Harry S. Truman Turner. So he, that gives you an idea. He's a very dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. And so he and I hosted this Crossfire program, which he knew way more about. Every political topic came up. I remember once we had like midterm elections or whatever, and I don't know what's happening in Colorado or anywhere else. And Scooter knew all of these candidates. And I was like, oh, this is a close race. And so, but we did that a few times. And eventually, I think we, in part of this sort of, it was called opposing viewpoints, but we got in trouble because our library at the university at Missouri Southern had been broken into. And so it got broken into, and then at the exact same time, like 2 nights later, it was broken into. And then 2 nights later, at the exact same time, it was broken into. And so Scooter and I made that one of our sort of points on opposing viewpoints. And we just railed on campus security. We're just like, how bad is this that they're breaking in at the same time every night, and our campus security can't dope find their way around? So we got kicked off the air for that one. And then the other show that I got canceled was my comedy show. So I had a comedy show that was called After Hours. And so I was when I was growing up, you either were or you weren't, but I was a Letterman fan. So I was a huge David Letterman fan. And so, when I debated for the university, I actually used to wear wrestling shoes to the debate tournament with my, odd looking colored suits that I would wear, because David Letterman used to wear wrestling shoes when he would come on way back in the day. And so I remembered I wanted to have a show like that. So I had a comedy show, and it was pretty cool. We actually did the first live show ever at Missouri Southern. Like, we got everybody to come in and work, and I had a live show, and I had a guest. It was really exciting. But I got in trouble for a segment that I had running on 3 shows in a row that was called Places You're Not Supposed to Go. And so we got in trouble because, well, actually, the one we didn't get in trouble for, believe it or not, we didn't get kicked off, was I actually kind of busted into the chancellor's office. So what happened was, we got the camera, we go in, we said, hey, is the chancellor here, to his secretary? And she says, oh, he's administrative assistant. She said, no. And we said, do you mind if we go in? And for whatever reason, she said, sure, go on in. So we went into his office with the camera, and on his desk was like the new budget that no one had seen and all these other things. And we were just filming everything, and we put that on. So that was one. The second one was we broke into, when I was an undergraduate, for the segment of After Hours, Places You're Not Supposed to Go, was our football field. We had Missouri Southern had the first AstroTurf in all of Missouri. So, and so they guarded this thing like it was Fort Knox. And so I remember Steve, who was my buddy, who was a cameraman at the time, really a tall guy. He and I had to jump the fence. So it's the middle of because this thing is locked up, right? But it's the middle of the day, and it was locked up. We had to jump the fence. We had to throw the camera over. Now, all this is running. We have the camera on at the time. So the camera's getting thrown over the fence. And so we just kind of wandered down to the field. And I remember there was a little high jump set up that I pretended like I tried to do, and I totally failed. And so that was a really fun one too. But the one we got in trouble for was we went to the local, like ABC or CBS, whatever, with the local, news station. So the local Joplin news station. And we walked in their door with our own camera. And they're like, hey, and a couple of them kind of knew me. And they're like, Todd, you can't come in here with that camera. And I'm like, well, we're doing that anyway. And we barged into the control room. And so they're like, no, you can't show this. And I'm like, what? This technology is not new. This is Joplin, Missouri. We're not showing anything. This isn't stuff the Russians that want, your secrets. But by the time we got back to Missouri Southern, the department chair, the dean, and campus security were all waiting for us. And so that was the end of that show. So that was the last show that I got to host.
Wow, that sounds like very fun and eventful times and everything.
Oh, it was fantastic. What was your story? What did you do?
Well, I think if you're not ruffling some feathers when you're in college doing television, you're probably not doing something right. We got in trouble. The one that I think that really got us in trouble was a cartoon that we did critical of some of the university's policies. And so very similar to you talking about the breaking in and everything.
Yeah.
So we had one episode, the student newspaper had been stolen one day. They had actually run a story about an incident that happened at, I believe it was one of the fraternities, some criminal incident that had happened at one of the fraternities, and it was on the front page of the newspaper. It so happened that that issue came out on a big visit day for the university.
Oh.
And suddenly the newspaper disappeared all over campus. You could not find it. And so the university blamed some student workers that they had acted entirely on their own and went out and stolen the newspaper all over campus. And nobody believed that. Nobody believed some student workers took this upon themselves. This was something that an administrator had ordered and then blamed the student workers, because what's going to happen to student workers in that situation? So we did a cartoon where we basically made the argument that the university had stolen it. Now, we didn't say our university. It was our fictitious university in the cartoon and everything. But they didn't like that. They didn't like that we depicted one of the administrators. His name was Brockway, and we had him as broccoli. And so he was actually a stalk of broccoli that walked around and talked, and they weren't very fond of that. And so those were the things that we mostly got in trouble for. I actually did a similar show, kind of like you were talking about Crossfire. Politically Incorrect was the popular show when I was in college.
Yes.
And so I did a show very similar to that. And we never got pulled for that show, but we did get some emails and everything with people very upset about things that got said on that show. So,
I'll be darned. Yeah, it's the one thing that I've discovered in doing all the shows is they would let you make fun of most people, but once you started to do something about the university, then they got a little bit upset. Like on my comedy show, I made fun of the mayor of Joplin in almost every episode, and then I actually paid for a friend who owned a photography studio to make a giant blown up photograph, like a giant poster of the mayor, and I always had that in the background somewhere I would go to on the show, and so we would talk about that. I remember the other time I got in trouble. You spoke of the newspaper. Like here we've got the Daily Egyptian, which is a wonderful paper. At our school we had the Chart, and I remember Chad Stebbins, who just recently retired. He was in charge of the Chart, and they were interviewing me for whatever reason. They were just interviewing me about debate or whatever, because I was an undergraduate. And I made a joke, and my joke was, I said that something, whatever I was talking about, was more interesting than a Gail Rinner lecture. Now, Gail Rinner, may rest in peace, was a very, very old professor in the history department, and everybody just knew he was one of the more, let's just say, non-interesting teachers. He was fairly boring.
Right.
And so I'm sure he was a fine teacher, but when you're an undergraduate, right, you hear all these things. And so I said it's more interesting. I was talking about one of my shows. I said, it's more interesting than a Gail Rinner lecture. And they published that. And oh my goodness, Chad Stebbins got in trouble. And he was like he was in charge of it. I got in trouble. I had to go apologize to Gail Rinner and the chairman of the history department.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it was, you can't say much bad about the university, and otherwise they pull back.
Yeah, we got in trouble one time for a comic strip in which we had an English professor as one of the candidates for running for the new president of the university, and we had some joke about him in it, and they said, no, you cannot do that. This is libelous. You cannot put this in here. And so our solution to that was to put like a Robin from Batman and Robin, like a little tie mask over his eyes, and then for his name, we just put poorly disguised English professor. And so then everybody paid a lot more attention to it than they did when we actually had his name on there. And we weren't even making fun of him badly or anything.
No,
he would have found it very funny.
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, I think if you're doing college media and you're not ruffling a few feathers, like I said. I don't think you're quite doing it right.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I actually really enjoy working here with the media we've got. So, whether it's the river region or other things. And so I really like seeing them. I remember I was downstairs doing one of the sort of WSIU sort of television. You know how they have television news, and they practice that downstairs. And so
Right.
I was in the communication building downstairs, and they were interviewing me about the presidential debates a couple years back. And the poor, I think he was probably a freshman, but the kid who was interviewing me was really nervous. And I'm just like, now, I've done this a million times, so I'm just like, it's fine, it's going to be okay. But then in the middle of his interview, the entire set fell. Just crashed.
Like the backdrop.
Just crashed behind us. And he just pretended like it didn't happen. And he was really nervous. And I'm just like, that's okay. We can laugh at that. We can.
Right.
So yeah, we have some good stuff here at SIU.
It wasn't one of those Buster Keaton moments like it fell around you.
No,
like you fell through the
it
window.
just fell. No, we were good.
Okay.
It didn't fall through the window, but that's pretty funny.
That would be amazing if that happened.
Good. That's good placement.
Yeah.
That is. That's good placement.
That's one of those things you don't think about when you're building the set. Like, if it falls, is it going to hit
Which
anyone?
direction will
Right.
it fall? Yeah.
All right. So obviously you did undergrad doing a lot of broadcasting, and then you go on and get your master's and get your PhD. And your PhD in particular is about interpersonal communication. And I kind of wanted to talk to you about one of the areas of research. So both your master's thesis and then your PhD dissertation both center around humor.
That's correct.
And particularly your master's talked about Andrew Dice Clay. That kind of maybe dates it.
It does date it a little bit, doesn't it?
And then your PhD was more kind of generalized using humor in conversation and everything. So I wonder, you said you don't do as much research on that now as you did at one point and everything, but that's always an interesting subject. When I talk to students and when I've taught public speaking and things like that in the past, that's always a point of contention because everybody wants to get up or some students want to get up and try to be a stand-up comic, right?
Yeah.
And there are always the inherent pitfalls in that. Everything from the obvious, they're not actually funny. But then also as, potentially being offensive and everything. So what are kind of the lessons that you've learned over the years, both from your research, but also from all the work that you've done with debate and everything when it comes to using humor in speech? And like, what are some of the tips that you might give the listeners?
Well, I find humor is actually, it was for my debate team here at SIU, I've found that humor was one of the more difficult things to coach because you're either you understand the timing, you understand it or not. Because I would give them, I remember once, probably a decade ago, we had the national champions from Ireland come debate. So they tour the country. And so we were one of the stops. We paid for them to come here and visit, et cetera. So we had them. So it's a different style and format of debate, but it's pretty straightforward. And so but because it's public speaking and we're not usually used to having a big audience, and I think we had 300 people show up for that. And I had my 3 debaters because it was 3 on 3. It was a little bit different thing. So we were practicing humor because we knew the Irish kids were going to be just really funny. They're very good. They're very smart, but they're very funny. And so we've written these jokes. All the assistant coaches and I were working on jokes all week. So we're working on, and I realized that you just can't give somebody a joke sometimes because they don't have the timing right. I mean, they would practice the joke 6-7 times in front of me, and I'm like, no, you blew it again. That's not where you hit the punch, And so we finally had to just work with their own personality. So the first thing I've learned about humor is you have to make your style of humor fit the personality of the person who it is. So maybe it's more self-depreciating, maybe it's others. So we found a really good way here at SIU. Because our first debater went up and he's like, just make me the punching bag, and so that's one of the things is instead of making fun of the Irish, the Irish would come in and they could make fun of us and people would laugh. But if we made fun of them, it made it seem like we were rude hosts. So the first thing I taught us is we don't make fun of them, we only make fun of ourselves. So you make fun of other speakers on our team or us, and so that's kind of one of the things. But humor is really, believe it or not, it's difficult to teach sort of how to be funny because it's like most things, it requires practice, it requires timing, it requires a lot of that. But what I've found in sort of my research is in interpersonal communication especially, is that if you have too much humor too soon, it's one of the things I teach my class, in a relationship that can be a little dangerous, only because you don't know like what the other person's sense of humor is, and you've kind of got to try to feel that out. So you might want to kind of hold back a little bit at the beginning of a relationship. But also, humor is a really good way, like on the inverse of that, it's a really good way to find out if your personalities match, right? So you know right away if your personalities match if you have similar styles of humor. And I've made arguments for a long time that a similar style of humor is perhaps one of the more important traits in two people getting along, right? So we have a lot of similarity traits, whether we belong to the same fraternity, same sorority, we're the same race, same sex, etc. But I've made arguments that the similar senses of humor are one of the things that keeps your friends tight to you, is because you kind of enjoy each other's humor. And there was a kid in my PhD program, Mike, who was a friend of mine, but I always thought he had just a terrible sense of humor. He told bad jokes. Nobody ever laughed at him, et cetera. And so while he and I got along, we were never really going to be tight, because I just always thought, Mike's not that smart because his jokes aren't that funny. But on the other hand, he probably thought I wasn't that smart because I never laughed at his jokes. So humor is a tricky thing like that. I don't know. What's your experience with it?
Oh, I mean, I think definitely that the same experience of that. Certainly when you're trying to teach humor and using humor in, say, a speech class or something, some people just can't use it, and they may actually be a very funny person, but they're not good at delivering it. Right. For whatever reason. So as I tell people, sometimes when people find out I've done work, writing humor and stuff, they're like, oh, well, tell me a joke. And I'm like, I'm terrible at telling jokes. Yeah. Like, I hate telling jokes. Yeah. Like, you can write me 20 jokes and I'm going to be like, really don't want to tell any of these. But I'm much better in a conversation, like responding to someone and, hopefully saying something humorous on like more off the cuff in those sorts of situations. Yeah.
And it just depends on if the people get your sense of humor as well. I've had debaters on this team that I've known after like 1 year, and national champions that I'm just like, Ben, who just recently got married, and I went to his wedding. I never even attempted to make Ben funny, because Ben just that wasn't his personality style. That wasn't him in a debate round. But I had other debaters like Mike Selk, who was, and Kyle Dennis, very funny. Kyle, you didn't have to coach at all. He just had a really good sense of humor.
Sure.
Mike, though, if you've ever noticed in humor, especially interpersonally, there's a fine line between funny and mean.
Sure.
And so Mike would tell a joke to start one of his speeches in debate. Maybe it's a semifinal round, and he would say something about the other team. But it depends. Here's the fine line. The fine line is simply in the tone in your voice. Mm-hmm. Mike would say it too aggressively because he was all excited and he was ready to give a speech. And so he would have a little shot at the other team, but it would just come off as mean and rude, and he was a jerk. And so I had to tell him, like, Mike, your jokes just aren't working. You're setting them up, but then you're saying them like you're angry. And right. so a little bit of it is that. And, still to this day, we struggle with it, right? So, we'll talk about later my CNN columns, but one of the main problems I ever have there is I usually put about 10 jokes into those, and my editor usually cuts out every single one. And so we have a running fight after all the presidential debates about, okay, come on, leave these in. And so there are a couple editors I like more than the others because they get my sense of humor. But you can just tell when somebody doesn't get it because they just scratch out and they're like, I'm like, no, I was hysterical. I set that joke up with the line before, I did this. And so some people, it's just very, very hard.
Well, while we're on this topic and everything, I don't know if you've been following the whole kind of PR nightmare going on with Netflix right now with Dave Chappelle's comedy show.
I have.
And so the PR nightmare isn't even entirely about the show itself, but more the response that Netflix has given, like multiple responses, and each one has been more tone deaf than the last, it feels like. But that is something that I think a lot of people are really interested in right now is, we seem to be in and I think this is maybe slightly misleading, but we seem to be in an era where we're changing what is acceptable in humor.
Yeah, we are.
And we're talking a whole lot more about, the concept of punching down.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that. There's a couple of just cardinal rules in humor, and one is you don't punch down. And for those people listening who might not be aware of that concept, it basically means you don't make fun of people who have less power than you. or less power than those, above them, et cetera. So because that's just not funny. They already don't have power, et cetera. So that would be an instance of the Dave Chappelle show, of his Netflix special is, he was punching down against transgender folks. And it's also just right there, easy targets. And so because they don't have as much power as you. And so that's one of the problems of that. And that's what I wrote about in my dissertation is inappropriate humor. What humor do people find inappropriate? And pretty much, it depends a lot of times. People told me that it might be sexual, it might be racial, it might be gender-based. They aren't always inappropriate, though. And what people generally told me is it depends on the intent. If you think the intent of the person is like, going along, et cetera. And so that's a tricky one. It's like the Supreme Court decision on pornography in the 1960s, which is, we can't define it for you, but we know it when we see it.
Right.
Right. Well, and it's the same thing with humor. I think, and because Dave Chappelle, one of his responses is, I had a transgender friend and she thought it was okay, and so I'm sure it's fine. Well, one of the problems is that, which is, by the way, just a horrible answer, because that's the whole I can't be racist because one of my best friends is black sort of a thing. Right. And so you can't say, just as a tip to anyone listening, don't ever, when you're accused of something, saying I can't be that because I have a friend who's that. That just doesn't work. No one ever buys it. It sounds horrible. But I think the Chappelle problem was that people felt like it didn't come from a place of love, right? They didn't feel like he was being like part of, they thought he was really picking on the transgender community and he was punching down. But if they would have thought perhaps his intent, or if it came from a transgender comedian, et cetera, if they thought the intent wasn't as negative, then they probably would have found it funny. It's weird, but I talked to like 80 people for my dissertation and they all said the same thing. Intent was important across the board. They would say, like, if we heard a race joke or a sex joke, et cetera, we won't laugh at it if we think the intent might be mean or demeaning, but we will laugh at some of them, maybe even the same joke, if we don't. And so it's a really interesting thing. People sort of have a fine line in their own sort of schemata about how they look at jokes, and they try to figure out when it's acceptable to laugh and when it's not acceptable to laugh. And that's kind of what the debate is that we're having right now.
And that difficulty is, sometimes people don't realize that their intent is not coming across in what they're saying, right? Yeah. Like their intent may be, I'm not trying to be mean, but the audience doesn't know that. Like they're not conveying that clearly.
Right. And I'll be real honest with you. I was, I love going to see stand-up comedians. And so my partner Christopher and I went when we were in Vegas, a few years back. We actually, Christopher thought this was a terrible idea. So I did this without telling him. I'm like, I bought tickets to Carrot Top. And he's just like,
I've seen Carrot Top in Vegas.
He's hysterical.
He's great.
He's hysterical.
It's like the best show you'll see.
I know. And so Christopher didn't believe it because he gets made fun of by other comedians, right? So other comedians think, he's cheating because he's a prop comic and he's, but he's funny. And so if you go to see, so I bought Christopher tickets to that, and that was a good one. But unfortunately, the other one we went to was John Lovitz was doing, he was on it with Dana Carvey, two former Saturday Night Live. They had stand-up together. We went to that. Right. Dana Carvey's fine. He used to be a stand-up comedian, so he knows how to do this. But John Lovitz never was. And so all of his jokes were like, at least half of them were either against gay people or against transgender. And Christopher and I just couldn't stand it because we're sitting there feeling like he's talking about us. You know, and so that's part of the problem. He clearly wasn't doing it from a place of, he was doing it from, this is an easy joke. Drunk people in Vegas will laugh at this because the superiority theory of humor says that we laugh at things because we feel better than them. It makes us feel superior to those who are infirmed. That's it. Old Thomas Hobbes' 1651 theory started with superiority theory. And that's what we felt like. We felt like we were getting picked on. And so we were there with another couple, Aaron and his wife Batia, and they were just like, we wanted to walk out, but we didn't know what to do. And we said, we wanted to walk out, but we thought you wanted to stay.
Right.
And so, but Dana Carvey was fine, but John Lovitz was mean and hateful, we thought. And so, that does make a difference.
Yeah. And, I think that's always an issue that students run into about, and you hear these complaints, well, why can he do that joke and I can't do that joke? And the obvious answer is he can do that because he's part of that group.
Community. Yeah, he's part of the community.
I have a visual disability, and so sometimes I'll make jokes about being visually disabled. Sure. And my friends and family will laugh, but if I ever make those jokes around people who don't know me, and obviously it's an invisible disability, somebody just meeting me would not know it, But I have made those jokes before when other people are around. They're like, oh my God, how could you possibly say that about blind people? And I'm like, well, I kind of feel I can get away with it a bit because this is something that I'm dealing with.
Right. Right. And it's the same thing with when I teach my interpersonal class, I'll tell you a story that I haven't actually probably told very much, probably never here at SIU. For my first, I don't know. So I got the job here in 2000. And for my first, 7 or 8 years, I taught interpersonal. And you have to use a lot of examples about your relationship in interpersonal. And so, I've been with Christopher since 2001. And so, I would just say my partner.
Happy anniversary. That's 20 years.
Well, 20 years, just a month ago. We had our 20-year anniversary.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, it's fantastic. 20 years is a long time. That's really good. But Christopher, I would never use his name. I would just say my partner. And I also wouldn't say a pronoun of he. It's because it was the year, remember, think of 2001, 2002, 2003 here at SIU, and I just didn't know if the students would be accepting. Right. So for all those years, I would tell all these stories about my partner, but I would never say a name. Mm-hmm. And so I just assumed, I'm like, well, the students probably know that I'm gay, but I wouldn't make it a thing, right? And so because I didn't know how it would be accepted at the time, right? So we're still being rejected by people like Christopher's father, and so it's still, I wasn't sure if they were ready for it. And finally, I just asked one of my debaters. I just said, because my debaters know everything about me, right? And so they all met Christopher, and they've been to my house in St. Louis. And so I just asked him, and when Cameron graduated in 2005 or whatever, he's just like, Todd, they're ready for it. You can say his name. And so since then, I've just been like, yeah, my partner Christopher, and I talked about him yesterday in class for probably 15 minutes, because that's an example. And so then I can tell some jokes occasionally. So I can have Christopher, who's super gay, because I call him super gay sometimes because if the class didn't know I was gay, I couldn't call him super gay,
If he was just some random person you were talking about.
Exactly, right? Exactly. Yeah. So I found that, they have to know you're part of that. They have to know that you're part of it if you want to joke about anything like that, or they have to know that it comes from a good place. But yeah, for the first 5-6 years here. Here's a funny story from one of the classes downstairs. I remember teaching one day, I was teaching downstairs, and I said my partner, and this is before, I'd ever told the classes I was gay. Right. And one of the students raised his hand and said, well, when she does that, do you believe blah, blah, blah? And so I just answered the question. 10 minutes later, somebody else asked a question, and they said, well, when he does that, do you think he blah, blah, blah? And I just answered that question too. And so clearly one of them was wrong, but I didn't open up and tell them at the time. But I went back and I called Christopher, and I'm like, oh, guess what just happened? And so it was pretty funny.
Yeah, we were talking about that maybe 2 months ago about how people interviewing now often use the term partner to describe who they're with, and that used to be a term that was used primarily by homosexual people to describe their partner instead of saying my spouse, my husband, my wife. But now lots of straight people use that term.
Yeah, and that's really cool. And there's an excellent example. When I was getting my PhD at Arizona State, and so I was buried in the closet at the time. So I was getting my PhD at Arizona State, and one of the fellow cohorts of a PhD student, she kept talking about her partner. Well, when we go, she was having a little Halloween party, and you'll get to meet my partner, and she'd always called my partner. Mm-hmm. And we got there, and it turns out it was her husband. Right. And we were all just like, oh, we thought you were gay. And so because she always called her husband her partner, but now that's way more common to just say, my partner.
Right. We, at a previous job, we hired a woman, and throughout her entire interview, she kept referring to her partner. And so after we had decided we were going to hire her and everything, one of the women in the department asked me, do you think she's gay? Because she kept saying partner. And I said, I don't know. Maybe I didn't really think a whole lot of it. Years later, I told this woman that we hired that, yes, we actually weren't sure if you were straight or gay. And she said, why? And I said, well, you kept using the term partner. And she said, I didn't even think about it the entire time I was using it.
And this is a neat thing for communication studies students, I think, too, because one of the things that I'm able to note that like Christopher might not notice or other people might not is I pay so close attention to language. Now, it's not just because I'm a communication teacher, but it's also because I'm a debate coach, and I know that the difference between words, just one sentence can make the difference between winning a debate and losing a debate. And I have a famous example of that, which is that my team lost a round one time where they said that the other team fell for our trick. Right, and they did, and so, but the judge voted against us because the judge thought we were too deceptive. The very next time we ran the same argument, we simply changed that one sentence and we said, they stepped into our trap. And we won that debate because then the judge could act like they knew it, they were part. But the difference between fell for our trick and stepped into our trap makes it like they were more active. They stepped into a trap that we'd set up versus fell for a trick makes it seem deceiving. So little things like that you notice as a as a researcher, and obviously I have a master's in rhetoric, but I think that's really neat. So yesterday this just came up. So one of our favorite shows to watch is American Greed. I know this sounds ridiculous.
The CNBC show,
yeah,
right?
But Stacy Keach is really funny. He does the background and he's like, so somebody's like, I swear I didn't do it, 120%. And then Stacy Keach in the background will go, 120%. And so, but it's really funny. So we're watching the show, and it was about Ray Nagin, who is the mayor of New Orleans, who's currently in jail. Mm-hmm. So for corruption and stuff. And he said one thing toward the end of the show, like because they had him talking after like the jury had said guilty and everybody said guilty. He said, I still maintain my innocence. And I had to hit pause. And I said, he just said he was guilty. And Christopher's like, what? And I'm like, you got to pay attention to the language. Would an innocent person ever say, I still maintain my innocence? Because the first part of that is still maintain indicates maybe you won't maintain your innocence at some point. Indicates maybe it's pliable or movable, right? That thing that I still maintain my innocence. You say that about other people that you're not sure about. You don't say that about yourself. I would never say, I still maintain my innocence. I would say, I'm innocent, right? And so when he said, I still maintain my innocence, I hit pause and went, oh, he's guilty. Like if I was on a jury, that's all I would have needed to hear because we use particular language choices to mean certain things. And that to me was just a dead giveaway that he was playing a game, that he was maintaining innocence, but that he knew he was guilty.
He's speaking in legalese.
Yeah.
Is what most people would say.
Yeah, but he's speaking in legalese about his first person, and you just wouldn't do that, right? If you didn't commit a murder. There's another famous one where somebody killed it, and he goes, well, there's only, so he was convicted of murder on this show or whatever we were watching, and it was like a Dateline type of show or whatever, and I had to pause that one for Christopher too, because he said, well, there's only two people that know the truth, and unfortunately, she's dead, and he'd already been convicted. So it was, he'd killed a woman, and he said, unfortunately, she's dead. And I hit pause, and I went, nope, guilty. And Chris was like, why? I said, if you didn't do it, there's three people who know you didn't do it: the dead person, you, and the person who did it. So when he said there's only two people who know this, and unfortunately she's dead, I'm like, guilty. So you've got to watch. I find that fascinating about communication. If you really pay close attention, there's giveaways everywhere. It's also why I'm a terrible liar. I just think I'm a terrible liar because I've taught Christopher enough of this that I can't even try to lie to him anymore because he can spot things right away that I've said. That I'm just bad at lying. But yeah, it's neat when we study this, you can just little changes like that. And in coaching a debate team, you listen for little things like that are just giveaways.
Well, I think you become more self-conscious of your language when you teach this and you're in it every day. You start thinking about your word choice more.
You do. And this is sort of a battle we've occasionally had is one time we were having a little argument and Christopher told me, he said, well, Todd, I feel like I always have to watch what I say around you. And I looked at him and I said, that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing to watch what you say. I think it's a good thing to be careful with your language choices because I've had to be careful with mine for 30 years, So yeah, you do. You notice that more if you're in communication.
Well, let's talk about one of those areas that you have to be very careful in your language, which is debate. And so we kind of teased it a little at the top, and we've kept coming back around to it and everything. But you are the debate coach here, and so one of the things I wanted to give you the opportunity to enlighten us is to explain exactly what is competitive debate, because I think most people are familiar with debate from presidential debates, right? That's what most people think of, but that's a very different format than the competitive format.
That's true. True.
So what is a competitive debate when you're coaching? What does that actually look like?
Well, it can look from either one versus one. So it's one debater versus one. The most common is two people on a team. So it's 2 versus 2 in a debate. But now we're actually in a form of debate that's called world-style debate, British parliamentary debate. And it's actually it's 8 people in the debate. So
Oh,
you're
wow.
a team of 2 still. So Southern Illinois will have a team of 2, but we're on, like, there are 2 sides to the debate, those for the topic and those against the topic. And so there'll be 2 teams arguing for the topic, 2 teams arguing against the topic. That's a fairly newer form of debate. It's really large right now. It's across the world, et cetera. But typical debates are just you get a topic, one team goes like on for the topic, and one team has to argue against the topic. You do some styles of debate because debate is never cordoned off like sports is, which is like big schools have one conference, smaller schools have one conference, and so I try to teach people that right away. Though it's all one, so
there's no mid-majors.
There's no mid-majors or anything like that. But the difference is there are different styles of debate, just because some people prefer to debate in different styles. So we might not be in the same sort of competitive league as, let's say, a Yale. If Yale is doing one style of debate and we're doing a different style, because debate coaches kind of change and they go with the flow, like British parliamentary, which is a big style now. All the top universities in the world do it, but 10 years ago, not very many of them did it. Not as many of them did it, and so that changes based off, because people always say, "Well, did you beat Harvard this week or whatever?" And sometimes I say, "Well, Harvard's in a different, but we did beat a different Ivy League because they're in, they do the debate that we do." So at Southern Illinois, we've always tried to do whatever's the largest form of debate. Typically, it's called policy debate, and then it became sort of parliamentary debate. But the big difference is in policy debate, you might have one topic for the whole year. And at each tournament, you'll have like 6 debates. You have to go 3 times for the topic, 3 times against the topic, et cetera. But that topic is so large, there are lots of subsets within it. So you just keep researching the same topic. Whereas the style of debate we do now, parliamentary style debate, you get a different topic every round. It's announced to the entire tournament. So you show up at a tournament. Let's say we go up to Loyola in Chicago. Dave Robinelli up at Loyola, because we have a tournament this weekend online, actually. And so they'll announce the topic, and then you get 15 minutes to talk to your partner or whatever about anything that you need to know about that topic. But they tell you what side you're on and who your judges are, and then they tell you the topic, and then you've got to go. So basically, you have 15 minutes to get ready for any kind of topic. It can be national, it can be international, it can be legal, it can be economic. And so you have to be much more well-read in this particular form of debate, because there's only so much that I can help them with in the preparation, et cetera, in 15 minutes. They have to know a little bit about everything. And so I find that fascinating, this new form of debate that we've been doing for quite some time. It's because I think the students are more well-rounded. They have to read the news every day in order to kind of, because if you only get 15 minutes and you don't know what it is, we famously had a debate one time where we actually were debating at the World Championships, and my team was really good, but had not debated in that style before. So my team's good, but we knew we weren't going to do well. It was a new style of debate. We were good debaters, but the topic came out. We had to go first. And the topic was South Africa should accelerate its land redistribution process. My team had never researched South Africa. They had no idea. And so we walked in, and the judge got there a little late, and she's like, "Well, I'm sorry to hold this up. I hope I didn't waste anybody's time." And my first debater stood right up and said, "Well, if you think that was a waste of time, wait till you hear my speech. Here's what I've figured out." Because we also were unable to use computers at the time. So it was just whatever you knew, you and your partner. Neither one of them knew anything, and they weren't able to talk to me. And I knew a little bit. And so he said, just by the words in the topic, it says, South Africa should accelerate. So we will assume they're already doing this thing. Land redistribution. We guess that means giving land back to, native black folks, because, it's been taken over by white people in South Africa.
This is post-apartheid.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It was post-apartheid. And so they should accelerate their land redistribution. He said, and that's about all we know. That's it. And that was the end of his speech. He was so proud because he thought he'd figured out what the topic meant, but he didn't know anything about it. And so that's what this form of debate does to you. It forces you to read about lots of stuff, because otherwise you could end up embarrassing yourself.
So how do you coach that? I mean, obviously you're coaching them to read more, and to you're probably providing news sources that they should be checking into and everything. How do you function as a coach in that, beyond, the teaching them the basic fundamentals of debate structure? what's going on at a tournament and everything that like you're doing as part of that?
Yeah, most of my coaching is actually argument coaching. It's not really coaching. And this is what one of the misnomers is about debate or debate coach. They think, well, I'm just teaching techniques of debate, like how to speak better, et cetera. And that's very little of what I do, frankly. Sure. Most of what I do is coaching on arguments on issues. So if the issue comes up, I will say, because, I have to be real well-read. And so we will talk about it briefly before the round, and I'll say, they'll throw out some arguments that they want to make, and I'll say, that's not a very good argument. Here's a little bit better argument. Here's an even better argument. Here's why it's strong. And so what we do is we kind of map out the round. The best way to describe what a debate coach does is it's strategic. So like if I had a whiteboard, it's like a football coach who draws up plays on the whiteboard and he says, okay, the receiver's going to go here, the other receiver's going to go here. I do that for debate. So I say, okay, our first argument is this. Our opponents only have two different directions they can go. If they say this as a response, and then I'll write it out. They say this, we have these three possible answers. If they say this as a response, we have these three. But that requires you to know a lot about the topic. And so part of what a coach does is a coach really needs to know a lot about a topic. And when I had graduate assistants here, we had a really good sort of setup that the graduate assistants would give them some ideas, and then basically I would be the one saying, okay, that's a good one, let's do that, let's expand that, let's not that. So it really is based off what arguments do you think will do better, et cetera. And a lot of communication is also, who are you debating for? There have just been a lot of rounds where my debate teams have come out when they were freshmen and said, how'd we do? We did everything that you've taught us. And I said, you're going to lose, because the judge was in there thinking. And they're like, why are we going to lose? And I said, because I'm not your judge. You have to analyze your judge first. And so a lot of communication is, who is my audience? And so in debate, believe it or not, when we have 15 minutes before a round and we get the topic, half of that time, we don't even talk about the topic. We talk about the judges. We're like, okay, this is a judge. We had this judge because we try to keep like either a file or a good memory of our judges. We had this judge 3 months ago. They judged us on this. They're a little bit more conservative, so we think they like conservative arguments, so we should focus on that. So we talk about our audience. And so when I talk to my speech classes here or other classes, I talk about how you always have to adapt to your audience. Just like in interpersonal communication, we don't communicate the same way with our professors, with our fellow students, with our roommates, with our parents, et cetera. You adapt your communication to be more effective to whoever you're communicating to. So this is what I would talk to my debaters about, is this is what this judge likes. This is what this judge doesn't like. Let's make sure and make arguments that are in this judge's wheelhouse. And so we spend half of our time doing that.
So a lot of it is, figuring out who that audience is. Exactly. And figuring out like how they're leaning and everything. So that's got to be very difficult for students when they're doing this and everything to like start internalizing that of, reading body language.
Exactly.
And those sorts of cues.
Exactly. And here's the funniest part is because I've been doing this for so long, usually I'm judging at tournaments, but when I'm not judging, I sit at the back of the room and watch our own teams debate. So I'm the very back of the room. So all I can see is our teams debating and then the back of the judges' heads, right? Mm-hmm. Whoever's judging it. I always know if we've won or lost because just from seeing the back of them, I can tell from body language if they're liking our arguments or not. And I will watch them and I will watch our team, and occasionally I'll have to pull our team out after the round and go, you weren't paying attention to the judge. You went for an argument they didn't like. They liked this other argument you were making much better. Why didn't you watch them? And so from the back of the room, I can always tell that judge likes us or doesn't like us based on this, or likes this argument or doesn't. And so part of it is that you've got to read your audience and then adapt to it. I've always said that when in advanced public speaking, you have to be able to adapt to however well you're going, right? If you see that the audience is liking it or isn't, stay longer on one point, make one point better. Well, it's the same with debate. I tell my debaters, you've got to pay attention to the judges because at the end of the debate, you're going to have to make choices as to what arguments you think you now still want to continue on with in your rebuttal and what arguments you want to jettison and not keep debating. But that's based off what you think the judge is buying and what they're not buying, what they like and what they don't like.
All right. Well, we mentioned when I was introducing about debates, that the type of debate most people are familiar with is the sort of presidential debate. And really even more than just the presidential debates, I think people watch a lot of the Republican or Democratic debates because that's where, we end up with, in recent years, 15 people up on stage trying to debate one another. And that's more, a lot of people have already decided once somebody gets the nomination, they know they're voting that way or another. But like, you may not know which of the 15 Republicans or Democrats you're voting for. You actually, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, you work with CNN on this, so you have appeared on CNN as well as lots of other television shows and networks, sort of grading these debates and everything, and also doing contributing pieces where you go through after these debates and rate the performance of everyone. I was reading one of them last night, and you were saying, my best advice is don't be Jeb Bush.
Yeah.
But like, what do you see that has changed over the years? So, I used to talk a lot in class about the Kennedy-Nixon debate, a very famous first televised debate, and Kennedy won in part, or is given lots of credit for winning because he looked better on TV.
That's correct.
Even as something as simple as like he took makeup and wore makeup on TV, and Nixon was sweaty and looked uncomfortable
and pale.
And everything. What has changed over the decades when we see presidential debates and everything?
That's a fantastic question, because most people think that it's static. Okay, so pick your game, whatever your game is that you play, you watch, you enjoy. It doesn't have to be sports. It can be a sport, football, basketball, baseball, etc. But it can be whatever it is. I promise you, that game has evolved. So I play poker. I like to play poker. I play Texas Hold'em. They don't play Texas Hold'em today like they did 15 years ago. That game has evolved so much. The strategies are different. Everything is different. And if you don't keep up with it, like let's say I was a good player 12 years ago, that same style of play will lose all of my money today. So because the game evolves, right?
And in part, the game, when specifically about poker, is evolved because we start broadcasting on television.
That's exactly right.
So people were watching it, they were seeing it. In the same way with presidential debates, people see it every 4 years. And so if I'm going to run 4 years from now, I can see what works and what doesn't.
And those debates have evolved since then. My main complaint about the recent debates, I have a lot of complaints, but one of my main complaints is the Commission on Presidential Debates are the ones who kind of set up the debates, and they're chaired by Frank Fahrenkopf. But basically, they're a bunch of old political people. So like literally old. They're very, very old. And they still feel like we're debating because they don't have any debate experts. They're old political people or hacks or Democrats or Republicans or whatever, but they don't have a single debate expert. They don't have a single person like me who's done debate their whole life on the Commission on Presidential Debates. And so the rules that they've currently set up for presidential debates are still set like we're debating Nixon and Kennedy. But debates aren't like that anymore. We've gotten much more combative in debates. We interrupt a little bit more in debates. And frankly, the moderator has a way harder job these days. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that the debates, especially any debate that's involved Trump, is just going to be more mean, more rude. That's just how it is. That's how he is, right? You can't change him. So in order to, the worst debate of all time is the one that Chris Wallace, moderated this year, was the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden, where Trump literally just interrupted and yelled at him for an hour and a half.
Right.
A famous quote that one of the people working in the Trump administration said on the way out is, COVID hurt Trump. Getting COVID hurt him when he got COVID, as far as like getting reelected, but didn't hurt him nearly as much as that first presidential debate where he just screamed at Joe Biden for no reason for an hour and a half or yelled at him. And that was Trump's own people saying that. And so one of the things is that the debate has evolved such that moderators need to be a more heavy hand. Because people just aren't as nice as Kennedy and Nixon back in the day. You can't just ask a question and expect them to do that. You've got to be involved in the debate. There's more lying that's happening in debate now, which is just a shame, and it sickens me. But there's more just non-truth telling in debates, especially again, given that Trump was in the debates. He set the record for the most number of like false statements in debates, et cetera. But moderators have to be able to like fact check that. But they've found that fact checking it after the candidate says something doesn't work, because the candidate's going to push back on you. So it has to be fact-checked during the question. So you say something like, well, President Trump, 2 years ago you stated this, and then you stated this, et cetera. So if you do that during the question, then you just can let them go a little bit better, because you've already basically fact-checked whatever they're about to say while you're doing the question. But if you do it afterwards, it seems like you're a partisan, it seems like you're unfair, et cetera. And so the other thing is that like the debaters themselves, the candidates, whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, whether it's Clinton, they've gotten better at sort of working the refs. right? And so, you know how coaches always work the refs. That wasn't a foul. You shouldn't call it. And maybe the refs let you get away with the next one. Well, it's not just Trump's team that did that. Everybody does it. But Trump's team is particularly good at working the moderators. Before the debate ever comes out, they're already saying, well, this moderator's not going to be fair toward us. This moderator's pro-Democrat, et cetera, because what they're trying to do is get the moderator to go a little bit lighter on them during the debate. It's a smart strategy. It's a strategy used in every game, right? I've used it as a debate coach. When we've had people that have voted against us, I've talked to them in private afterwards, and I've kind of given them a little bit of the business and let them know, well, because I'm working the refs. I'm not thinking about that debate. I'm thinking about the next time they judge us.
And when you mention sports with that, you're talking about like coaches after a game. So the basketball coach comes to the press conference and says, oh, the refs really killed us out there. They were showing a clear bias and everything. And the idea is not that the NBA is going to change the outcome of that game. It's that the refs will be more hesitant the next game to call those fouls.
Right.
So that, it'll be more in their favor for the next game.
Little football joke here, but you want all of your refs to be like you are the New England Patriots. So, because everybody always used to complain that New England always got all the calls.
Right.
But yeah, that's what you want to do. You want to try to get it. And I think we see that. You've heard the term makeup call in basketball or in football or baseball, right? And there's a makeup call here and there because they think they might have got one wrong, so they get it right. And so that's what you do in debates, right? So the political candidates are working the moderators. Before the debate ever starts, they're criticizing the moderator for stuff that hasn't happened yet, because they want the moderator to take it a little bit lighter on their candidate.
Do you think that the Republicans have had an easier task with that because they have spent so much time saying the media is biased, the media is liberal and everything, that inherently anybody that they bring in as a moderator, unless they're from Fox News, let's say, that person, but even Fox News,
Chris
Megyn
Wallace.
Kelly.
Or Megyn Kelly, yeah.
Megyn Kelly got really hit hard by Trump and everything, that she was biased, and Chris Wallace as well.
She absolutely did. Did you know that Trump, the one of the primaries he lost in 2016 was Iowa? And I actually made this statement at the time. I said, this is going to happen. He's going to lose this. It's because he skipped the Iowa debate. And I know a lot of times you're like, well, there's 10 people in these debates, or 12 or 15 or whatever. There's a lot of people in these debates, and I'm pretty sure it's Iowa, by the way. I'll have to double check that. I'm almost positive it was Iowa. But the one debate he skipped, it was because he was angry. He was like Megyn Kelly or whatever. But he actually ended up not coming in first place in that primary because he skipped that particular debate. But you're absolutely right. And they actually came out with the list this last year of potential moderators, and they were all far right-wing commentators, right? And so you're right. They have an easier time at working the refs because they've been saying media bias for forever. So whoever the media puts out there, they're going to say bias. I mean, Trump didn't even like Chris Wallace this year. And Chris Wallace has been on Fox News, and he's done debates before, and he was really good, frankly. In 2016, he was one of the better moderators. In 2020, he had the worst debate of all time, and it's partially because one of the things in debate is the moderators need training too. So he should have practiced. He should have seen that Trump was going to be a little bit more belligerent, interrupting, etc. But I think Chris Wallace slid on his reputation. He's like, listen, I handled this in 2016. I'll be fine in 2020. And he didn't realize the debates had changed that much since then. And so he couldn't handle that at all. It was a really terrible time.
One of the things that I see happen in debates sometimes is that somebody comes in just hammering the other candidate. This person is incompetent. I feel like happened with Biden, that Biden was depicted as, old and incompetent, and like maybe he was slightly even senile. And then when Joe Biden shows up and he does well in the debate, like he doesn't even have to do great. Yeah. He just has to do okay.
Yeah.
And, and that was part of Trump in 2016, I feel like, is that people were like, he's a buffoon. And then when he would show up and do, he would slightly above buffoon, he would look great.
Yeah, Donald Trump in 2016 did really well in the debates that had more than 4 people because when you don't have as much speaking time, you're better at like getting little shots in, getting little things in, because you don't have to go into depth on the issue. Right. When he would get in trouble, when it was just like 2 or 3 people in the debate. But I mean, Ted Cruz is the senator from Texas who was running for president in 2016. It was a national champion collegiate debater. National champion.
He went to Harvard, right?
Yeah, he went to Harvard and Yale, I think. He has degrees from, it cracks me up because he talks about these elites all the time. He has 2 degrees from Ivy League schools. But he got smoked by Donald Trump. And it was just because he wasn't used to what I call street debating. Donald Trump is going to throw out ad hominems. He's going to do these things. And Ted Cruz didn't know how to handle that. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Ted Cruz thought, I'll be able to beat Donald Trump, no problem. And then when Donald Trump would do things Ted Cruz wasn't ready for, he just didn't know how to handle that. And so go 4 years forward, unfortunately, that was one of the mistakes the Republicans were making in the debates pre-Biden. They were already setting the expectations too low for Biden. They were like, Biden doesn't know what he's doing. Biden's kind of senile. And right. Everybody I know who knows this is like, you should be doing the opposite, right? Because when you do that, and if all Joe Biden has to do is meet that low bar, people will think he won the debate. Even if he didn't win, did he exceed his own your expectations of him? And if he did, therefore he won. It's one of the reasons why I think people like to interview me, why I've been writing CNN columns for now, more than 10 years on debates, is because I always draw analogies to my own teams. Right? Mm-hmm. And so even though people are like, well, competitive debate, it's nothing at all like presidential debate. Well, that's just not true. Trust me, I do them both. So I know there are a ton of similarities. While they might not be the same in speaking style or the amount of evidence, in how you persuade people they are. And my own teams here at SIU, when we had that great run, we were always expected to win every debate.
I was just about to ask, that 9 years had to hurt you in some ways.
Very much. There was never a debate we went into that we weren't expected to win. And so we would lose an occasional debate because the other team came close to us.
Right.
And the judges were just so impressed that they came close. So basically, if it was like close to a tie, the judges would be over impressed with the other team. And I would just be, and we might lose, and I would be like afterwards, those weren't important arguments they were making. And so it would be a little frustrating. So it works for you sometimes, obviously, because we have the reputation coming in. The judge thinks we're going to win. So in some ways, it's really good, right? So Don't get me wrong. I think it helped us way more than it hurt us, because in most rounds, if it was a tie, we'd win because they thought we were supposed to. But then there were other rounds where the team just beat their expectations, and so the judge would vote for it. So I know for a fact that when Trump and his team were saying like Biden was senile or incompetent, I'm like, all Biden's got to do is give a decent debate, and then people will think he won.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what happened. I thought he was better in both those debates.
So looking forward to 2024, and I know in a lot of ways none of us want to even be thinking about that quite yet, but obviously discussion is already going on about certainly the midterms next year, but already for the presidential election in 2024. You've talked about the evolution of debates. Obviously, Trump in 2020 changed debates again, right?
Right.
They like sort of confrontational, just yelling at Joe Biden, as you were mentioning, and everything. What do you think debates look like in 2024, and how dependent is that on if Trump runs, or does whoever the Republican frontrunner, do they like mimic and copy that because it's been so successful for Trump?
That's a fine question. I think that Trump is unique in that he is still able to be funny. Trump is funny. Trump can be really funny sometimes. I mean, he does a Marco Rubio impression that just cracks me up every time.
I mean, there is a reason The Apprentice was a hit show.
Yeah.
He was entertaining.
He's very entertaining. And I've written that in many columns that I think Trump can be really, really funny. But the problem is if the candidate is not Trump in 2024, there's a fine line. They have to be, because if you're just going to be mean, that doesn't come across well. You have to also have that. So it's tricky. I think not having Trump in the debates will make the debate better. But Trump might be in these debates. Who knows if he runs again, et cetera. But the one thing is, I think the moderators need to be told beforehand, here's how you have to change this. Here's how you have to do sort of these debates, or do follow-ups, or, here's how you have to handle it when these things happen. Because, it's going to keep happening if the moderators don't get hold of the debates. Because right now, people are not seeing enough punishment. In the collegiate circuit, you get punished if you lie. Right? You cannot lie in a debate, because people think debaters are the ones who maybe lie the prettiest. And so I had to do so many interviews. So I'm on Canadian television, I'm on the BBC, I'm on CNN, I'm on all of these radio networks, et cetera. And I have to explain, this is not what debate is. Debate is about truth seeking. And so that's where we start. Debate is a search for the truth. That's why we debate. Which policies are better? We air them out, we talk about them, and it's a search for the truth. And so in collegiate, high school debate, et cetera, if you ever get caught lying, you will not only lose that round, but let's say you won that debate and then people later found out you were, a couple of your arguments you just weren't truthful about, you lied about. it gets around the circuit. No one will ever vote for you again. No one will even ever vote for your school again. So at SIU, the first thing I tell my freshmen when they come here is don't ever lie in a debate. If you're not sure about something, there are ways to say that, but you don't ever lie in a debate because it will come back to haunt you and the rest of our squad. Because I've seen it happen where I've judged teams before and I'm like, oh, this is like, there was a time that we had some trouble with UMKC, University of Missouri, Kansas City. They're a fine debate program, don't get me wrong, and I love them now. But there was a time back in the day that they had a couple debaters that were sketchy, and none of the judges wanted to vote for them. None of their teams, because we couldn't trust what they were saying in the round. Unfortunately.
Right. So you assume you maybe didn't catch the other person. Even if you caught the first person, the next person, even if you don't catch them in a lie, you assume you just failed and they're still lying.
Yes. Yeah. And so we didn't trust them as much. And so one of the reasons why you do well in debates is because judges trust you, right? And unfortunately, one of the things that we've seen in presidential debates is there probably hasn't been as much punitive damage. There's not as much punishment for lying. I mean, most people who watched the debates, Trump versus Clinton, thought that Clinton won those debates. But in part, when I wrote columns, it was because Trump was lying all the time, right? Mm-hmm. So he was fact checked, and he lied on average of 22 times in the debate, whereas Clinton would lie on average of like 4 or 3 or something like that. So that's one of the things is we have to make sure that people understand truth is what debate is about, and I think that's part of what the moderator should say to the candidates, to the audience to start with. Remember, we're about seeking the truth. This is part of what debate is, because if we lose that, then debate frankly has no purpose. If debate isn't here to try to find the truth, then I'm not really sure what it's there for. Right? And so that would be my focus. That's what I would say to keep on.
So one final question about debate. Do you see that sort of national level, let's say Trump effect, filtering down to more local races or even to students as they're coming into a debate program? Are they trying to mimic that debate style because that's what they've seen?
I have seen more of that. And I wish that was not my answer, but I've seen more of that, especially in political debates. But especially in political debates because, the lesser tier debates don't get fact checked that much,
Mm-hmm.
And so you can just say a lot because frankly, politicians will just go and say something today on television that's already been fact checked and they're just flat out lying and they know it, but they will repeat the same lie. So there's a difference between saying something, not knowing if it was true or not, and then getting fact checked and then going back. So like Biden has done that, right? Biden has said some things that just weren't true. He got fact checked and then he improved on it the next time he gave a speech or whatever. But a lot of politicians don't do that anymore. They just don't care. So because they found that the fact checking doesn't work. Like you said earlier, it's once you get to the final Republican and the final Democrat, most people are just going to vote for their party line, whichever one they like the best. So what I've found is what makes the biggest difference is in the primary debates, right? When there's 15 of them, because if your candidate has a bad debate, you're like, I'm really for this one candidate. But if they have a bad debate, you've still got 14 other Republicans to choose from, right? But once you get the final one out, you're like, well, we've only got one Republican and I'm a Republican, so that's what I'm voting for. So I do think that the fact checking, the telling the truth is super important. I think that we've gone away from it a little bit too much, but I think we can get it back when the moderator's reminding everyone that this is about a search for the truth. And if they know more, right? If they know more about the candidate's history and they can put the questions properly, I think we can get much better debates. So even some of the Democratic primary debates, we didn't have Republican primaries because Donald Trump didn't have any opponents. But the Democratic primary debates in 20, some were better than others because the moderators did a better job of holding their feet to the fire, right? And making sure that they said, well, that's not what you said earlier, et cetera. So I think that's important.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time, but as this is a podcast about communication, we always like to end with this question about what's something that you're watching, reading, listening to, playing, or whatever that you would like to share with our audience.
Well, I mean, I watch, I don't watch too much television, but I watch enough that, Secession's a show I watch. So I tend to watch the shows that do pretty critically well because I don't know what I'm supposed to watch. So I see and so, I watch Ted Lasso, I watch Secession. I haven't watched Squid Game yet. I know it's a big deal because everybody in all of my classes is talking about Squid Game. And so I'm like, I should probably watch the Squid Game. So one of the things is to be, I think, an effective teacher. I like a lot of pop culture references. And so I need to make sure, speaking speaking of Dave Chappelle, my best lines in my old classes used to be about the Chappelle Show because everybody watched that back in the day. And so I would come in and talk about one of his segments. And so one of the things I try to do is make sure that I'm at least up. And so when I figured out nobody else, at least none of my students, would be watching Ted Lasso, I'm like, well, that's disappointing, but I have to scratch all those from my lecture. So
that is disappointing. Yeah, Ted Lasso.
That is really disappointing. So I try to watch those kind of shows. So I watch that. For reading, I read basically, my pleasure reading is the same as my work reading, which is about the news. I'll read the news for 4 hours every day. That's just what I do. So I've got about 40 websites saved and news sites saved on my computer. And I even have them labeled, international, legal websites, conservative, liberal, et cetera. And I'll read them every day. So because it's important for me to stay up on the news to say what's topping. As far as listening to, I've got terrible taste in music. So I listen to whatever the radio stations tell me I'm supposed to. I don't go out and buy music. I've got just the worst taste. So, and I'm the last one to find out about songs. I'm not kidding you. The Little Nas X song that had been #1 for a year,
Old Town Road.
Old Town Road, I had never heard. And so like it had been out for a year, #1. And I'm like, what is this Old Town Road people are talking about? And so I'll be the first to admit, I've got terrible taste in music. So it's basically whatever the radio plays for me. I'm like, sure, that's good.
I find sometimes that I discover a song when it's the remix, and that really makes me feel old. It's like, the song has come out, it's played through, and now they're going to go back and remix it, and that's the first time I've heard it, and I'm like, okay, I'm really out of touch because I'm not hearing this.
Listen, I really appreciate that Christopher's my partner's more technologically superior to me, and so he likes TikTok. I don't ever go on TikTok, but he will tell me what songs are popular because apparently there's songs on TikTok that people do the same dance to or whatever.
Sure.
I'm not there. I don't understand it, but he's always like, oh, so we'll be at the gym working out. He's like, oh, that's a big song on TikTok right now. And so like if he tells me it's popular, I'm like, okay, I got to remember that. That one's it. That one's a good one.
All right. Well, thank you. So real quick, as we're wrapping up here, Todd, how can people find you if they want to find out more information about you or they want to follow you? I know that you have a website and some.
Yeah, I've got a website. So I managed to trademark the phrase America's Debate Coach. So you can find me online at americasdebatecoach.com. You can find me on Twitter if you look for America Debate or America's Debate Coach. You can find me on Facebook at America's Debate Coach. But there, I just post about debate stuff on Twitter and Facebook. So you won't find me posting very often. So if there's presidential debates or debate stuff, I'll put stuff there. But you can find my website. It's got all of my most recent television interviews from the 2020 campaign. So I've got that. I've got a YouTube page, America's Debate Coach. So you can find me there. But obviously you can find me here at SIU. You can find my email here, so I'm always around. I'm doing something around here.
All right. And you can reach me if you have questions or comments about this podcast or this specific episode by emailing me at justin.young@siu.edu. Todd, thank you very much for taking time out of your day. This has been a great, fun interview to do with you.
I loved it. This is awesome. Yeah, let's do more of these.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone for tuning in, and we'll be back soon with another guest.